This is the Plagmanrules Podcast. Everybody, welcome to the Friday edition. It is Friday, September 22nd, and we have just two topics to talk about today. The first one I'm going to talk about is this trailer that just came out for Peter Rabbit. I'll have a little bit of an explanation for why I want to talk about that. And second of all, we're kind of going to do a little bit of a wrap-up of the summer box office, and not the one that you normally anticipate, which is like the top 5 highest grossing films and all that, and the bottom 5. No, instead we're going to be talking about what their expectations were, and kind of the 5 that bottomed out and really fell below expectations, and the 5 that exceeded expectations. Okay, so let's start with this. Peter Rabbit. It's a film they're doing here. It's coming out next spring. It actually comes out next February. And I'll tell you what, maybe for why this is not typically a subject I would bring up for the podcast here. Now, here's the thing. If you're not familiar with the original parable or the original story, The Tale of Peter Rabbit, it's an old book from the early 1900s. It's about Peter Rabbit, who's an actual rabbit, who goes into Mr. McGregor's garden and starts to kind of pick at all the different things of the garden, and then eventually Mr. McGregor spots him, and he has to run and hide, and he almost, he kind of risks life and limb just to get some food out of the garden. And he gets some of his clothes left behind. Mr. McGregor makes a scarecrow out of him. It's a nice parable for young kids to be obedient to your parents, because Peter Rabbit's parents warned him not to do it because they knew what was in store. And it's also one for, not being greedy and kind of just taking what you need and not being a glutton. And it was really a parable that I was taught as a kid, and it was my favorite kind of story as a kid. Not to call it a nursery rhyme, but it was in that same thing, where it's like, it's my favorite of those. So when I heard a couple of years ago when they were putting together a project that would be around Peter Rabbit, I'm like, wow, they can really make this into a great movie and make it good, as long as it's around the same lines as the animated Charlotte's Web movie, which was excellent, and it's a classic in every regard in that case, and it was a great adaptation of the story where they added elements that worked or that made it more fun. And I thought if they could do the same here with Peter Rabbit, and they have like Domhnall Gleeson and Margot Robbie and a few others in the cast there, James Corden is going to play Peter Rabbit, I'm like, that is a solid cast too to put around this and to make a really good movie about this. And it's a story that not every kid who's growing up today knows, and it's a great one to teach them because I think it's a great life lessons kind of story. Little did I know what the details of the project were going to be. I did not know it was going to be a mix between animation and live action. I didn't know who the director was. I didn't know what direction they were going to go in as far as what the story was. So, this morning, and it came out, by the way, I'm recording this on Thursday, so it came out Thursday morning. I got to see the trailer here, and I'm not going to hold back here. Fuck these people. Fuck these people who made this movie. I'm kind of at a loss for words here, but this looks like the biggest garbage heap that I could have ever imagined. I mean, pretty much, if you haven't seen the trailer, I'll try to describe it as best I can, but I don't want to go too far, because reliving this could put me into PTSD mode. It is so jaw-droppingly awful. So basically, what happens is the narrator at the beginning makes a joke about the fact that Peter Rabbit has a jacket on, but not pants. Okay, so is that supposed to be funny? Is it a streaker joke? What are they going for here? So that doesn't land. And then we get a whole thing about all the different animals coming together and stuff. And then there's this whole thing where they go into the house and they're wrecking the house. Every stereotypical Smurfs and, what was the one they did about the rabbits earlier? Hop. And all these other ones kind of do stuff like that to make it, one of those type of movies. And then you got Domhnall Gleeson as the live human being who walks in, and they have this whole scene where one of the animals pops up after they're hiding, and they scream at each other for 30 seconds, and it's useless, and it wasn't funny, and it's absolutely, it just pissed me off beyond all measure, and it's just a shame. I mean, like I said, this story is one that if you haven't taught your kids this story, this is one to go and find, because you can either just read off the plot description online, or you can find the book itself. Beatrix Potter, by the way, is the author who wrote these, and she's got a whole bunch of stories around Peter Rabbit. I haven't investigated any of them myself, but just the first one I know almost by heart how it goes, and it is such a near and dear to my heart kind of story that it just kills me and absolutely mortifies me that they could have turned this into such a garbage idea of a film to give it the Smurfs treatment, to make it a live action and animation mix, and to make it the lowest common denominator type of kids movie. It is an absolute crime to do it to this story. And I personally, when they did the Smurfs movie with Neil Patrick Harris, and they've done how many of those since, I wasn't really, for lack of a better word, I was not offended by this, by the material, because the Smurfs was not a near and dear thing to my heart when I was young. I never really paid attention to it. But I now understand all the frustration and all of the angry nature of the fans of the original Smurfs and the original Scooby-Doo. That's one we can throw into. That was the same kind of directing pair and the same idea, where if you really loved the stories as a child, and now you see a big screen adaptation of it, to see it regarded in such poor taste, and to see it regarded as an absolute, again, lowest common denominator type film that is only going to be in theaters for a few weeks, and then people are going to forget about it, and the kids are going to go see it. They'll laugh at all the poop jokes and all the stupid animal jokes and all that, and some of the parents might get a kick out of, an occasional joke that leans on an adult humor level. It's going to play on cable sometimes, and nobody's going to remember it. And it's such a shame, because that is going to taint the image of this character, of its story, of the author even in some regard, and it is absolutely, again, a crime. Just an absolute crime to make this happen. And I seriously, I don't even want to mention anybody who was involved in the movie, because they don't deserve any credit whatsoever for this. It is an absolute travesty. And I am personally very, very taken aback by this and crushed by this. This seriously has made me so angry that I am not even gonna recommend anybody to go see this when it comes out. I'm not gonna pay attention to it. I'm not gonna say anything about it when it comes out. Maybe, if I'm still doing the podcast come February, when we get to the box office results, maybe then I'll mention it. It'll be so brief that I won't even want to go near it with a 10-foot pole. So seriously, I'm gonna say this now, because it'll probably play on YouTube now, and it'll have 100,000 hits by the time this is all over and said and done and everything. But to seriously, and this is a message to any parents, babysitters, aunts, uncles, anybody who, at any point, grandparents even, who are going to take kids to see a movie, in the next few months or anything, when this trailer comes up, I want you to watch your kids and see how they react. If they want to see it, teach them a lesson and let them know that these are not the type of movies that they should be seeing. Because these movies take all their brain cells out and pretty much make them stupid kids forever. And this is kind of a classic quote that I think the critic, his name was Paul Simon, or it was somebody Simon, went on Nightline years ago and talked about how the Star Wars movies were making kids dumb. Well, okay, if he was around today, I know he's passed on since, but if he was around today, he would say the exact same thing about shit like this. And seriously, a message to anybody, who's potentially thinking about maybe one day taking their kids or the people they watch, babysitters in that case, or grandkids, whatever the case may be, nieces, nephews, cousins, whoever's going to take people to see this, just skip it. Skip it and see something great. See something that really builds the imaginations of the kids who are watching it. Something that inspires them. Something that makes them think. Something that makes them really latch onto the movie. We've had a couple of really good examples here in the past few years of kids' movies that, sure, sometimes do go for that scatological humor and all the poop and fart jokes and everything, and they still have a lot of great morals or a lot of great stories or characters or other parts of the movie that work, that really, really are better examples of child entertainment. For example, Zootopia from last year, won the Best Animated Feature category at the Oscars, very deserving, is a great movie. And it was one of my favorite films of last year. That's one, if your kids haven't seen it, I'm sure they have. Go and make sure that they watch that. A couple from this year. The Lego Batman movie. Still one of the best films so far this year. I know, it is kind of a thing where if you don't want to get your kids hooked on Legos, maybe that's a great reason not to let them watch it. But still, a lot of great humor, a great story, and really great messages in that one. And really one that got really overlooked this summer was the Captain Underpants movie. Again, that one, does sometimes go for that really lowbrow humor, but it is smart about it. It teaches kids lessons, it lets them really get into the characters, and it's a very fun experience for them. And it's only 89 minutes, and a lot of these movies are, relatively short. But it's something they can watch over and over again and really get into. And something like this, something that is not trying to be anything good. Something that is just out there to be a cash grab, to catch on to the name, and to get some of the recognition of the original stories and the original author and the original parables and stuff. Seriously, this needs to stop. This just needs to quit. I know this little video I'm doing now is not going to make a lick of difference, but seriously, this shit has to stop sometime. Somebody has to grow a brain at some point and realize that these movies are not helping children learn about the original stories. Instead, they are hurting them. They are making them say, oh, this is the version of the story I'm going back to. Same thing happened with the Dr. Seuss adaptations from the mid-2000s. And the same thing happened with Scooby-Doo. The same thing happened with the Smurfs. There's a couple other examples, but I think you get my point here. This is going to be an absolute travesty when it opens, and nobody should go see it. Nobody should even mention it. I know it's got a few recognizable stars and names and actors and everything in it, but seriously, what the fuck were they thinking with this other than let's get some cash in and bank off of this recognizable name? Seriously, this is something, again, and I'll quit after this, but to parents, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, anybody who's going to take kids to go and see movies here in the next few months, skip this one, come in late to the movie so they don't get a chance to see the trailer. Just don't let them get exposed to this. Instead, read to your kids. Or, when they're over, if they're visiting, if they're not your kids, show them the tales here of the Tale of Peter Rabbit. Show them the story. And there's some, I'm sure there's stuff on YouTube or old tapes. I was raised up on the tapes where they would just show the pictures and they would go through and they'd have a narrator go over the whole story. Show them that if you can find a version of that on YouTube or something, or a live reading of it or something, or read it to them yourselves. You've got smartphones, you've got your Amazon Fires, or whatever they call them, the stuff, the tablets and all that, where you can just pay like 99 cents for a book and sit down and read the book to them in it's a couple chapters, I think. It's, relatively short book. But seriously, they are going to get so much more out of this in this version where it's the actual tale, it's the actual parables, the actual life lessons they can learn from this, and not from a shit-filled hour-and-a-half fuckfest about talking animals that is absolute bullshit. Don't let them get dumber this way. Seriously. I cannot stress this enough. This is the type of stuff that comes out that makes kids dumber. And I just don't want to see it happen. And especially for me, it's too late now. The movie's coming out. They can't cancel the movie or anything. But to see it happen to such a beloved character of mine, one that I grew up on and loved from a very young age, and still to this day remember all the life lessons and all the details of the story, it is just a crushing defeat and such a horrible, horrible day. Okay, I'm going to try to move on from that. Just don't bother. Just do not bother with this shit. I mean, it is not worth it. Okay, so let's move on now. We're going to talk about some of the wrap-ups here of the summer box office season here. And this is kind of a weird experiment I've been doing here the past couple of years, where I keep track of tracking numbers for what the domestic opening and the domestic total gross is going to be for a film. And I kind of split it up into the different seasons here. So with this, what we're doing here is counting up the top 5 and the bottom 5 of expected gross in the States here. So that means if a movie did very well and it did, say, more than 100% of its expected domestic gross, then it'll be on this list, or in that consideration for the top 5. And it just so happens that in the top 5 here, we have 5 films that were above 150% of its expected gross. So let's go ahead and we're going to name those films off now. And number 5 was The Glass Castle. This is actually a more recent release. And this one, of course, the Brie Larson film, only expected to get about $10.5 million here in the States and has to date grossed a little over $16.5 million. So if you do the math there, that's roughly 160% above its expected gross. Up next, we had a tie, actually, so this is going to count for number 4 and number 3. Girls Trip and Annabelle Creation both earned 164% above their expected domestic gross. So let's start with Girls Trip first. That one was only expected to get up to $70 million here in the States, and at this point has come very close to getting up to $114.5 million. And actually, it is still playing in a few theaters, so it could reasonably get up closer to, say, 170%. And the other one here, and that was Annabelle Creation, is now past $100 million at the domestic box office, only expected to get $61 million. So those, again, tied for that percentage, and that's both at 164%. So we'll skip up to, I guess it would be number 2 now, and this is actually one that not many people saw, but still, Lowriders. This one came out in May, actually. It was expected to get $3.5 million, is now over $6 million at the domestic box office, or 176% of its expected gross. And kind of a surprise here. The number 1 film that surpassed expectations at the box office as far as its total domestic gross was the Halle Berry thriller Kidnap. Now, this film came out in August, kind of a more recent one, and was only expected to gross $9 million when it came out. And its total now is very close to $30.5 million, or, do the math here, 338% of its expected gross. That is incredible. Very rarely do we see a case like that, where expectations are so low and they actually get to a decent number and a respectable number at the box office like that. And so, yeah, we'll run down those again. So again, number 5 was Glass Castle at 160% of its expected gross. We had a tie for number 4 and number 3, technically speaking, would be Girls Trip and Annabelle Creation, both at 164%. Lowriders was number 2 with 176%, and Kidnap number 1 with 338%. Okay, now we'll go down to the bottom 5. These are all at 50% or lower as far as their expected domestic gross. So number 5 was another recent one, All Saints. This is one of those religious propaganda kind of films, not to sound really bad about it, but kind of that's the way they advertise it. Expected to get $12 million here in the States, only grossed about $5,300,000 for 45% of its expected total. Number 4 was a horror film, came out in June, and that was It Comes at Night. Now, of course, I think part of the big problem here was just the trailer was really selling one film, and it turned out to be a completely different film. But it was still expected to make $33.5 million here in the States, only grossed just shy of $14 million for 42% of its expected gross. Number 3, this one kind of pains me. I haven't seen it yet, but from what I've heard, it's actually a really good movie, Detroit. This one, expected to gross $41 million here in the States, only grossed a little over $16.5 million for 41% of its expected domestic haul. For number 2, we have another June film, and that was Rough Night. Remember that one? The comedy with Scarlett Johansson and them? Expected to get $65 million through its total domestic gross, only got a little over $22 million. For 34% of its expected gross. And coming in at number 1, the biggest disappointment in the box office when we consider expectations of domestic gross is The House. Remember this one, the Will Ferrell, Amy Poehler comedy? Expected to get $80 million in its whole domestic gross, only earned $25.5 million for 32% of its expected gross. So yeah, we see a couple of comedies that really failed at the box office this summer, and of course Girls Trip being the exact opposite, the polar opposite there. That one got way above what it was supposed to. So we see that comedies were really scattershot through the summer here. We saw that a few dramas like Detroit and Glass Castle kind of flipped, and of course thrillers like It Comes at Night and Kidnap again flip-flopped there, where some of them really just did not sell with the audiences, or the audiences were really taken aback and just not really liking what the film was instead of what it was advertised to be. And something like Kidnap, where you have such low expectations, and I guess there was an audience for the movie and they went out to see it, and those who went to see it really liked it. So that one just skyrocketed in its expected gross and really surpassed a lot of expectations. And then, of course, something like Annabelle 2 is another example there, where that one 164%, but I think a lot of that had to do with the lack of competition at that time, too. Now, as far as why Lowriders got such a big response, I don't know. That one I don't really have an explanation for. And as far as All Saints being on the list there for one of the bottom 5, some of these religious-oriented films, some of them do really well. Because remember, we had War Room from a couple of years ago, and that was another kind of the same genre of film here. That one came out and did 377% of its expected gross. It was only expected $18 million and got close to $70 million. It was actually about $67.7 million. And then we have some like God's Not Dead that also did extremely well. But then we have ones like God's Not Dead Part 2 that really did not do well. Or this one, All Saints. So we got a good mix here of those kind of films as well. Sometimes they really hit, and sometimes they don't. All right, so that was kind of fun to do something a little different there. Yeah, like I said before about that whole part with Peter Rabbit, again, just skip it. Don't let your kids see the previews if you can. I mean, just don't expose them to it. And read to your kids. Read to your kids the original stories. They are so good. At least that first one. Like I said, I haven't investigated all the other further chapters and the further stories, but if you can, try and find a clip on YouTube or something of the original story being told by a narrator. It is such a better experience for the kids than seeing these obscene, absolutely garbage films. Okay, so I think that's all I got for today. Now, just a couple of quick reminders before we go here. Don't forget to comment here on YouTube if you have a suggestion for the show, something you think would help, or something you like or don't like. And don't forget that I also have a separate Gmail account that's Plagmanrules at gmail.com, Plagmanrules podcast at gmail.com. You can leave a comment there as well as far as the quality of the show, if you like it or don't like it, or any suggestions or tips. And then also, if there's a topic, something that I missed, something that you want me to talk about, go ahead and leave a comment, or again, use that Gmail account to get in touch with me and say, hey, why don't you talk about this? Or I have a suggestion for you if you want a request of some kind as far as content that would be on the podcast at a later time. Go ahead and leave those tips there or suggestions there. All right, so that's going to be it. We'll be back on Monday. We'll talk about what happened at the weekend box office. We got a couple potentially record-setting films opening up here. And, well, not big records, but as far as maybe surpassing some old records like Kingsman and Lego Ninjago could really do well this weekend. We'll see what happens there. And, of course, any other late-breaking news here over the weekend we'll get to. And if there's anything else that you guys want to talk about, just be sure to shoot me an email or leave a comment here on YouTube. And if I got enough time, I'll be sure to fit it in on Monday's show. All right, so until then, this has been the Plagman Rules Podcast.